Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Jean Hewitt. I am faculty at UWM. It is my pleasure and honor to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, Leslie Proll. She is the director of the Departmental Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Transportation. She is the principal advisor to the Secretary of Transportation on civil rights and equal opportunity matters. She is responsible for ensuring full and affirmative implementation of civil rights laws and policies throughout the department. Previously, Leslie served as Director of Policy for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the nation's oldest civil rights legal organization. Leslie is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley and the University of California at Davis School of Law. Please warmly welcome Ms. Proll.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
On behalf of Transportation Secretary Anthony Fox, I am just so glad and honored to be here today. This is just an absolutely incredible location and forum and audience, and it's Saturday morning to boot. I'm actually fairly new to the job. 9 months in, I come from the civil rights community. I am very inspired and motivated by what you all are talking about today. We have, many challenges ahead, but I have to say this is exactly what we need to be doing. This is our path forward, okay? So as a civil rights lawyer, I am also a student of civil rights history, and what I wanted to do this morning is to talk a little bit about this history, and I am going to talk about Rosa Parks, but I want to reinforce some things. I think it's really important to know and talk about our history to give us some perspective about what we do and who we are today. And I also think in my 9 months on the job, it helps to educate people when you talk about the history to what we are doing today. I have done a lot of voting rights work. I've done a lot of employment discrimination work. I've done a lot of fair housing work. I've done a lot of criminal justice work. You don't have to explain that when you say those things to people about what you're working on. When I say I'm the head of the Civil Rights Office at the Department of Transportation, people go, what's that? Eyes glaze over. And so I say, you start with Rosa Parks. And, this has always been an issue. We have lifted up this year, the 60th anniversary of the bus boycott, as a tool for educating people about the importance of these issues. We've been celebrating the boycott all year. In June, we took the Secretary Fox, down to Alabama State University to commemorate the boycott in Montgomery where it happened. And Alabama State, I hope you all know, had a significant role in that boycott. They staffed the boycott. They famously produced all the mimeograph flyers for the city of Montgomery. And I wanted to share with you something that Secretary Fox said in his remarks there. He said, we can use the lessons of the boycott to address issues of today. When Rosa Parks sat down and set off a firestorm that was the year-long boycott, it took people sacrificing to step away from what was a convenience to make the point and to change the system. And I think really those are our marching orders today. In order to advance principles of equal justice, all of the necessary components that were used that year need to be engaged today. You had community organizing, you had litigation, you had compliance, and you had cooperation. These are interrelated, and they need to be embedded into our cultures. So from Homer Plessy's challenge to segregated rail cars back in the 1890s, transportation has been linked to the struggle for racial equality. In fact, challenges to segregation in transportation played a very large role in challenges to jury segregation writ large. In fact, Thurgood Marshall, who founded the organization I used to work for, he used to talk about the school cases and the transportation cases. And in fact, when Brown versus Board came out in 1954, the iconic civil rights decision, the case obviously had immense consequences for the nation's public education system, but it was quickly used to dismantle other government-sponsored action in many other areas, including government-sponsored segregation and transportation. And in fact, the Rosa Parks litigation, there was certainly the boycott, but the litigation that ultimately ended the segregation on the buses came only a year after Brown versus Board of Education. And not many people realize that. It was one of the first legal cases to use Brown to do something somewhere else, and it was in transportation. And I also wanted to make sure you knew that, when the boycott first started in community and they were looking around about how to sustain this, who's going to be our leader, they went to a very little-known pastor at that time, whose name was Martin Luther King. He really got he became the leader of that movement and got his start in the civil rights movement because of what Rosa Parks had done. And I just also want to share with you the Montgomery Improvement Association, that was really the organizing group that sustained the boycott 60 years ago. They're still alive and kicking today. And they work on the issues that you work on. And I have to share with you their motto because I absolutely love it. And they say, from the back of the bus to where's the bus? Yeah. So the lawsuit that came out of the bus boycott, Thurgood Marshall was involved. I don't know if you know, Rosa Parks actually wasn't the plaintiff in that. She was being prosecuted in the state courts for her, what she did on the bus. So they went to 4 other women who I think names ought to be repeated because they were also victims of those policies, and they stood up and became plaintiffs in the lawsuit. Aurelia Browder, Susan McDonald, Claudette Colvin, and Mary Louise Smith. And it was their suit that ended up ending the segregation legally in the city of Montgomery and everywhere. And the Brown decision, which had been rendered only a year before, was featured prominently in this decision. The court noted that it had rejected the doctrine of separate but equal in Brown and said that requiring segregation of the white and colored races on the motor buses violates the 14th Amendment just as much of the Constitution. So that's Rosa Parks, but I want to also tell you about another transportation case of Thurgood Marshall because I love this case as well, and not too many people know about it. This is a case called Boynton versus Virginia in 1960. Bruce Boynton was a Howard Law student traveling home for Christmas to Alabama on a Trailways bus. He stopped in Richmond, Virginia, where he tried to get something to eat in a white-only restaurant in a bus terminal in Richmond. He was arrested, and his case went up to the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall argued it. It was actually Thurgood Marshall's last case that he argued before the Supreme Court before going onto the bench. He won it, as he usually did. And the Supreme Court held in that case that the prohibition on segregation in interstate transportation services applied not only to the buses themselves, but to the facilities and services related to bus services, like waiting rooms, like the lunch counters at the bus station. So they got this victory in 1960. And what happened was, what the civil rights leaders discovered was, even though the Supreme Court had issued this ruling, the southern states were not following it. And they were still segregating the lunch counters, the facilities, in fact the buses, all over the South. And you may know where I'm going with this, but what this ended up leading to is the civil rights leaders, John Lewis and others, they wanted to test whether the states were complying with this order. And therein started the Freedom Rides. That was designed to test the Boynton versus Virginia ruling. And we all know that John Lewis and others got on the buses and came in through the South, Rock Hill, South Carolina, Anniston, Montgomery, Mississippi, part of civil rights history. So I wanted to leave you with that as well. Couple things just about the Boynton family, in case you're civil rights historians. Bruce Boynton's mother was a woman by the name of Amelia Boynton. She lived in Selma, and if you saw the movie Selma, she is the woman who convinced Martin Luther King to come to Selma to support the voting rights movement there, which led to Bloody Sunday and everything else with respect to the voting rights march. And you may remember a couple years ago, President Obama invited her at the age of 105 to come to the State of the Union address. And she ended up walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with, well, she wasn't walking. She was in a wheelchair, but she held President Obama's hand as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in the commemoration of the Selma to Montgomery Bloody Sunday March. And she passed away, unfortunately, last year, but you know, it's a real tribute when you think about this family, their role in history in both voting rights and transportation justice. So I wanted to make sure you all knew that and you're armed with that when people next time ask you, what is civil rights in transportation?